When Isabella Montgomery chose love over luxury, her wealthy family didn't just disapprove, they erased her from their lives. Trading her penthouse view for a farmhouse on the horizon, she built a life with James, the man they deemed beneath her. 5 years of silence stretched between them, until one day the Montgomerys came knocking. Not for reconciliation, but for something else entirely. They needed a favor, one that would change everything. Isabella Montgomery grew up in the prestigious heights of Boston's Beacon Hill, where old money whispered through colonial brick walls and success was measured in yacht lengths and summer homes. The Montgomery name carried weight in social circles, and her father, Richard Montgomery III, made sure everyone knew it. As the CEO of Montgomery Financial Group, he had built upon his family's banking legacy, turning millions into billions through shrewd investments and calculated risks. Her mother, Victoria, orchestrated their social life like a master conductor, hosting charity galas and sitting on museum boards. Every aspect of their lives was carefully curated, from Isabella's education at the finest private schools to her younger brother Alexander's grooming to take over the family business. But Isabella had always been different. While her peers competed for internships at prestigious firms and chased eligible bachelors from equally wealthy families, she found herself drawn to environmental science and sustainable agriculture. Her parents tolerated her phase through college, expecting her to eventually fall in line with their plans for her future. That all changed during her final year at Harvard, when she met James Cooper at a farmer's market near campus. He wasn't selling artisanal cheese or craft kombucha like the other vendors, just honest, dirt-under-the-fingernails vegetables from his small farm an hour outside the city. His hands were calloused from real work, his smile genuine, and his knowledge of sustainable farming practices more extensive than any professor she'd studied under. James had inherited his family's struggling farm after his parents passed away, and instead of selling it off to developers, he'd committed himself to turning it around. He'd studied agricultural science at a state school while working the land, implementing innovative organic farming techniques, and building relationships with local restaurants and markets. When Isabella brought James home to meet her family, the temperature in their marble-floored foyer dropped several degrees. Victoria's practiced smile barely concealed her horror, while Richard didn't even try to hide his disapproval. Alexander, ever the dutiful son, merely raised an eyebrow and excused himself to take a business call. "Darling," Victoria had said later that evening, cornering Isabella in her childhood bedroom, "you can't be serious about this. This farmer. Think about your future. Think about the family name." But Isabella was serious. After graduation, she moved to James's farm, putting her environmental science degree to work alongside him. They married in a simple ceremony at the local courthouse. None of the Montgomerys attended, though James's tight-knit community of farming friends filled the space with genuine warmth and celebration. The first few years were hard, really hard. The old farmhouse needed constant repairs, and every season brought new challenges, drought one year, flooding the next. But James and Isabella were building something together, something real. They expanded their organic certification, established a successful CSA program, and began experimenting with regenerative agriculture techniques. Victoria sent occasional texts on holidays, always cordial but distant. Richard remained silent. Alexander, now firmly established as the heir to Montgomery Financial, sent impersonal Christmas cards featuring photos of his perfect family in coordinating outfits on their perfect yacht. 5 years into their marriage, Isabella and James made a discovery that would change everything. While implementing a new irrigation system in the back 40 acres, they found traces of rare earth elements in the soil. Further testing revealed a significant deposit of these increasingly valuable minerals, crucial for manufacturing everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. James and Isabella kept the discovery quiet while they researched their options and consulted with experts. They knew that traditional mining would destroy the farmland they'd worked so hard to nurture. But there were new, environmentally conscious extraction methods being developed, expensive ones that required significant investment. Word of the discovery eventually leaked out, as such things do in small communities. It wasn't long before the story reached Boston's financial circles, and suddenly, Isabella's phone began ringing with calls from numbers she hadn't seen in years. First came Alexander, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Bella, darling, it's been too long. Mother and father were just saying how much they miss you at Sunday dinners. Then Victoria, full of practiced concern. Sweetheart, we've been so worried about you, living out there in the middle of nowhere. You know you can always come home. Finally, Richard himself called. His voice carried the same authoritative tone she remembered from childhood lectures about responsibility and family legacy. Isabella, it's time to have a serious discussion about your future, about the family's future. The Montgomerys arrived at the farm one crisp autumn morning in a convoy of luxury vehicles that looked comically out of place on the dusty driveway. Victoria's designer boots sank into the rich soil as she picked her way toward the farmhouse, while Richard surveyed the land with the calculating eye of someone already planning its transformation. Alexander had brought along Patricia Whitmore, a senior partner from the family firm's mining investment division. She carried a sleek leather portfolio filled with proposals and projections, all claiming to have the farm's best interests at heart, of course. James and Isabella welcomed them into their kitchen, where mason jars of preserved vegetables lined the windowsills and herbs dried in bundles from the ceiling beams. The contrast between their worlds had never been starker than in that moment. "We're prepared to make this situation advantageous for everyone involved," Richard began, as Patricia laid out documents across the worn farmhouse table. "The family firm has extensive experience in mineral rights acquisition and development." The numbers they presented were staggering, enough money to set up several generations in luxury, but their plans involved aggressive extraction methods that would render the farmland unusable for decades, if not permanently. "We can help you navigate the complexities of mineral rights and environmental regulations," Alexander added, shooting a meaningful look at his sister. "You know how these things can get complicated without the right connections." Isabella felt James's hand squeeze hers under the table as Victoria chimed in. "Think of what this could mean for your future, darling. You could have a real home again, in a proper neighborhood. Maybe start the family you've always wanted, with all the advantages you had growing up." The implications hung heavy in the air. The Montgomerys hadn't just come to make a business proposal. They'd come to reclaim their wayward daughter, to fold her back into the family fold now that she had something of value to offer. The farm's mineral wealth was their ticket to forgiveness, their justification for welcoming back the black sheep who had dared to choose love over legacy. But Isabella and James had already been working on their own plans. During sleepless nights, they'd researched and reached out to environmental conservation groups and sustainable mining experts. They had found smaller firms developing revolutionary extraction methods that could preserve the topsoil and allow for continued agricultural use of the land. The Montgomerys' visit stretched into the afternoon as they presented argument after argument, each one carefully crafted to appeal to different aspects of Isabella's past life. They spoke of philanthropy opportunities, of endowing university chairs, of creating lasting legacies that would benefit society, all while subtly dismissing the life she'd built with James. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, Richard finally played his trump card. He pulled out an old photograph from his wallet. Isabella at her college graduation, flanked by her beaming parents, the world still full of possibilities they could control. "You're still a Montgomery," he said softly, sliding the photo across the table. "Whatever has happened, whatever choices you've made, that blood runs in your veins. Let us help you claim your birthright." Isabella picked up the photograph, studying her younger self's smile, remembering the weight of expectations that had always accompanied her family's love. James watched her carefully, his presence solid and unwavering beside her, just as it had been through every challenge they had faced together. The moment stretched out, filled with the weight of choice, not just about mineral rights and extraction methods, but about the very definition of family, success, and legacy. The Montgomerys waited, confident in their position, certain that their prodigal daughter would finally see reason and return to the fold. But Isabella had learned something in her years on the farm that her family had never understood. True wealth couldn't be measured in dollar signs or social standings. It grew from the soil beneath your feet, from the community that surrounded you, from the love that asked for nothing in return except your authentic self. She looked at her father, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing him not as the imposing figure of her childhood, but as a man whose own views of success and happiness had become as rigid as the marble halls he inhabited. She saw her mother, still beautiful but brittle, trapped in a world of appearances, and Alexander, her once playful brother, now a polished mirror of their father's ambitions. The sun had almost disappeared behind the hills, painting the kitchen in shades of amber and shadow. As Isabella finally spoke, the kitchen clock ticked steadily as Isabella drew a deep breath. "When I married James, you said I was throwing my life away, that I was choosing poverty over prosperity, embarrassment over dignity. But sitting here now, I realize you never understood what real prosperity looks like." She stood up and walked to the window, where the last rays of sunlight illuminated rows of thriving crops stretching toward the horizon. In the distance, the lights of their greenhouse complex were switching on automatically, protecting the delicate winter crops they'd developed. The farm was a far cry from the struggling operation she'd first encountered years ago. "Isabella?" Alexander interjected, his tone patronizing. "Nobody's dismissing what you've built here. It's quaint. But you have to think bigger. The minerals under this soil are worth hundreds of times more than anything you could grow on top of it." "That's where you're wrong," James spoke up, his quiet voice carrying the weight of generations of farming wisdom. "The real value isn't in what's under the soil. It's in the soil itself, in the ecosystem we've built, in the families we feed." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Darling, you can feed people with the interest alone from what we're offering. You could feed entire countries." The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of trucks pulling up outside. Through the window, Isabella watched as their evening CSA members arrived for their weekly pickups. Doctors, teachers, local restaurant owners, and families who had been with them since the beginning. These people weren't just customers, they were partners in building a sustainable food system. "Let me show you something," Isabella said, leading her family outside despite Victoria's protests about her designer shoes. The CSA members nodded respectfully as they passed, some calling out greetings to James and Isabella by name. She led them to the demonstration garden, where local school children came for weekly lessons about sustainable agriculture. The raised beds were filled with heritage vegetables, companion plants growing in carefully planned combinations that maximized yield while minimizing pest problems naturally. "Last week, we had 63rd graders here, learning about pollination," Isabella explained. "Next month, we're hosting a workshop for veterans interested in agricultural therapy. The month after that, we're training farmers from developing countries in our irrigation techniques." Richard's expression remained stern, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps recognition of the leadership qualities he'd always tried to instill in his daughter, manifesting in ways he'd never imagined. "That's all very noble," Patricia Whitmore cut in, "but let's talk numbers." She pulled out her tablet, bringing up a sophisticated financial model. "Our projections show that with traditional extraction methods—" "We've seen the projections," James interrupted politely but firmly. "We've also seen what those methods did to the Carter farm 2 counties over. The land is dead. Nothing will grow there for decades." The group moved toward the front of the property, where their small farm store was still open. Inside, local artisans sold their wares alongside the farm's produce: honey from nearby apiaries, artisanal cheeses from a neighboring dairy, crafts made by area artists. The walls were lined with photos showing the farm's transformation over the years. A young woman approached them, pushing a stroller with one hand while balancing a basket of vegetables with the other. "Ms. Isabella, those regenerative farming techniques you taught us last spring, our community garden's yield doubled this year. We're actually producing enough to donate to the local food bank now." Victoria watched the interaction with an unreadable expression, her perfectly manicured fingers fidgeting with her pearl necklace. The gap between her world of charity galas and this hands-on community involvement had never been more apparent. As they walked back to the house, Alexander tried a different approach. "Think about mother and father's legacy, Bella. This could secure the Montgomery name for generations to come." Isabella stopped walking and turned to face her family. The setting sun cast long shadows across the farm, and in the distance, the evening crew was starting their chores. "I've thought about legacy every day since I left Boston, about what it means to build something that lasts." She gestured to the flourishing fields around them. "This is my legacy, not just the crops or the soil or even the minerals underneath. It's the knowledge we're sharing, the communities we're building, the future we're helping to create. You taught me to think about the long term, Dad. Well, this is as long term as it gets." Richard Montgomery's jaw tightened, a familiar sign of his growing frustration. "You're being idealistic, Isabella. The world doesn't run on community gardens and farming workshops. It runs on capital, on progress, on development." "Does it?" James asked quietly. He pulled out his tablet, not the latest model, but serviceable, and pulled up some figures of his own. "Our sustainable farming methods have been so successful that we've been approached by 3 international agricultural companies for consulting contracts. Universities want to study our soil management techniques. We're even developing a certification program for regenerative agriculture." Patricia Whitmore's eyes narrowed with interest. "You haven't mentioned any of this in the public records." "Because it's not about the money," Isabella replied. "It's about doing things right, about proving that profit and preservation aren't mutually exclusive." The group stood in silence for a moment, the weight of competing visions for the future hanging between them. The evening had grown cool, and somewhere in the distance a dinner bell rang, calling the farm workers in from the fields. Victoria shivered slightly in the autumn air. "You've always been stubborn, Isabella, just like your father." She glanced between her daughter and her husband, perhaps seeing their similarities for the first time. "But I never thought—" Her voice trailed off as a new vehicle approached the farm. A modest hybrid car with government plates. A woman in a crisp suit emerged, carrying a briefcase emblazoned with the state's Environmental Protection Agency logo. "Mr. and Mrs. Cooper," the woman called out, walking toward them. "I'm sorry I'm late. Traffic from the Capitol was horrible. I have those sustainable mining proposal documents you requested." Richard's head snapped toward his daughter, his eyes narrowing. Alexander quickly pulled out his phone, presumably to contact their legal team. Patricia Whitmore was already flipping through her files, looking increasingly concerned. The sun had finally set completely, leaving the farm illuminated by the warm glow of scattered lights, from the greenhouse, the store, the worker housing, and the main house. In that gentle light, Isabella stood straight-backed between her old family and the life she'd chosen, holding a vision for the future that was far bigger than any of them had imagined. The arrival of the state official, Dr. Sarah Chen, sent Victoria retreating to one of the farmhouse's wooden rocking chairs, her composure finally cracking. Richard remained stoic, though the muscle twitching in his jaw betrayed his growing tension. Alexander was already huddled in the corner, speaking in hushed tones with Patricia Whitmore, their earlier confidence visibly shaken. "As I was saying," Dr. Chen continued, seemingly oblivious to the family drama unfolding around her, "the pilot program proposal you submitted is quite impressive. The combination of minimal-impact mineral extraction with continued agricultural production could set a new standard for land use management." Isabella and James exchanged a quick glance, years of partnership allowing them to communicate volumes in that brief moment. They had spent months developing their proposal, working late into the night after long days in the fields, determined to find a way to honor both the land's hidden wealth and its living potential. "How long have you been planning this?" Richard's voice cut through the evening air, sharp as winter frost. "Since the day we discovered the minerals," James answered, his tone level. "We knew we had a responsibility, to the land, to our community, and to the future. We didn't want to just extract wealth. We wanted to create something sustainable." Dr. Chen opened her briefcase, spreading documents across the farmhouse's broad kitchen table. "The state is particularly interested in your innovative approach to topsoil preservation during extraction. The proposed method could revolutionize how we think about mining and agriculture coexisting." Alexander pushed away from his corner, his expensive suit looking increasingly out of place in the rustic setting. "This is absurd. You can't possibly have the resources to implement something like this. The infrastructure costs alone." "Actually," Isabella interrupted, "we've already secured preliminary backing from several environmental investment groups. They're interested in more than just quarterly returns, Alex. They're looking at the bigger picture." Victoria stirred from her chair, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you come to us first, Isabella? We're your family." The question hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken hurt and missed opportunities. Isabella felt James's steady presence beside her as she considered her response. "Would you have listened?" she finally asked. "Really listened? Or would you have seen only what you wanted to see, like you always have?" Before Victoria could respond, the farmhouse door swung open and a group of people began filing in, faces familiar to James and Isabella, but strangers to the Montgomerys. There was Miguel, who ran the organic dairy cooperative down the road, Dr. Thompson from the Agricultural University, Sarah from the local farmers market board, and several others who had been part of their extended farming family over the years. "Sorry we're late," Miguel said, setting down a cooler of his award-winning cheese. "Traffic was backed up because of some fancy cars on the county road." He winked at Isabella, clearly aware of exactly whose cars they were. Richard watched in barely concealed amazement as the kitchen transformed into an impromptu meeting space. These people moved with the comfort of those who belonged, pulling out well-worn chairs and organizing papers with practiced efficiency. Dr. Thompson, a respected authority in sustainable agriculture, cleared his throat. "Shall we begin the preliminary planning session? We have a lot to cover if we're going to make this pilot program work." Patricia Whitmore stepped forward, her corporate Polish suddenly seeming more like armor than authority. "I believe the Montgomerys have prior claim to any negotiations regarding this property's mineral rights." "Actually," Dr. Chen interjected, "the state is particularly interested in the Cooper's proposal because it addresses multiple public interest factors: environmental protection, agricultural preservation, and responsible resource management. Their application for the pilot program was fast-tracked due to its innovative approach." Alexander's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face paling slightly. "Father," he said quietly, "our legal team is suggesting we reconsider our position." Richard Montgomery III had built his empire by recognizing pivotal moments in negotiations. Looking around the farmhouse kitchen, at his daughter's quiet confidence, at the community of supporters she'd built, at the government backing she'd secured, he finally began to understand that he was watching another such moment unfold. Victoria rose from her rocking chair, her social graces taking over, despite her evident distress. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we should hear more about this pilot program." Isabella felt a momentary twinge of sympathy for her mother, remembering all the times Victoria had mediated family tensions with similar careful diplomacy. But there was no turning back now. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the chairs around the large table. "Everyone, please sit. We have a lot to discuss." The next hour unfolded like a carefully orchestrated dance. Dr. Thompson presented research data showing the viability of their proposed extraction methods. Miguel and Sarah spoke about the importance of preserving local agricultural infrastructure. Dr. Chen outlined the state's interest in creating a model for responsible resource management. Through it all, Isabella watched her family's reactions. Alexander took furious notes, his business mind clearly racing to understand this new paradigm. Victoria sat silent but attentive, her fingers still worrying at her pearl necklace. And Richard. Richard watched Isabella with an expression she had never seen before. As the presentation concluded, Richard finally spoke. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "Not everything," Isabella admitted. "There's still one piece missing." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "We need experienced financial partners who understand both large-scale project management and the importance of sustainable returns." The implication hung in the air like morning mist over the fields. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly as he recognized the opening for what it was. Not a surrender, but an invitation to be part of something new. Richard Montgomery sat back in his chair, studying his daughter with the same intense focus he usually reserved for analyzing potential acquisitions. But Isabella wasn't a company to be bought or sold. She had grown into something he barely recognized, yet somehow inherently understood. "A partnership," he said slowly, testing the word. "On what terms?" Before Isabella could respond, James stepped forward. "Full transparency, sustainable practices, community involvement in decision-making, and most importantly, a commitment to maintaining active agricultural production alongside any mineral extraction." Alexander let out a short laugh, though it held more surprise than derision. "You're actually serious about keeping this place a working farm? Even with what's under it?" "Especially with what's under it," Isabella emphasized. "The minerals aren't going anywhere. They'll still be valuable in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years. But this soil, these farming techniques we've developed, the community we've built, that's equally valuable and far more fragile." Dr. Thompson pulled up a detailed presentation on his laptop. The Cooper's integrated approach is actually quite brilliant from a business perspective. Traditional mining operations have a finite lifespan: extract, deplete, abandon. But their model creates multiple revenue streams that could last generations. Patricia Whitmore, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly straightened. Multiple revenue streams? The mineral extraction, yes, James explained, pulling out a thick folder of projections. But also, the continued agricultural production, the consulting fees from our farming techniques, the educational programs, the tourism potential of showing how sustainable mining and farming can coexist. Victoria, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing interest, spoke up. Tourism? Here? We've already had inquiries from 3 universities and 2 international agricultural organizations, Isabella said. They want to send people to study our methods. That means hotels, restaurants, conference facilities, all of which could be developed in harmony with the existing community. Richard's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. And you need the Montgomery Financial Group, because doing this right requires significant upfront capital, Isabella acknowledged. The specialized equipment, the environmental safeguards, the infrastructure development, it's all expensive. But more than that, she paused, meeting her father's gaze directly. We need partners who understand how to scale something without destroying its fundamental value. The room fell silent as Richard stood and walked to the window. Outside, the farm's evening activities continued. Workers heading home after their shifts, the last CSA members picking up their produce, lights twinkling on in the distance where the community's houses dotted the landscape. You know, he said quietly, when I took over from my father, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, Richard, anyone can make money. The trick is building something that lasts. He turned back to face the room. I always thought I understood what he meant. Victoria rose and joined her husband at the window. Remember when Isabella was little, Richard? How she used to follow you around your office, asking questions about everything. She smiled faintly at the memory. She hasn't changed as much as we thought. Alexander, ever the pragmatist, was already running numbers on his tablet. The initial investment would be substantial, but if these projections are accurate, he looked up, a newfound respect in his eyes. Bella, this could redefine how resource extraction is done globally. Dr. Chen cleared her throat. That's exactly why the state is so interested. If this pilot program succeeds, it could become a model for sustainable development nationwide. Richard turned back to Isabella and James. You understand that if we do this, if Montgomery Financial gets involved, we'll need certain guarantees, professional oversight, regular audits, corporate governance standards. Of course, James nodded, as long as those standards don't compromise our core principles. Your principles, Richard mused, almost to himself. You know, Isabella, when you left to marry James, I thought you were running away from responsibility, from your heritage. He gestured around the farmhouse kitchen, with its mixed group of farmers, academics, government officials, and corporate executives. But you weren't running away at all, were you? You were running towards something. Isabella felt tears pricking at her eyes, but held them back. I was running toward what I believed in, what I still believe in. Miguel, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Mr. Montgomery, your daughter and James, they've built something special here, something real. We all see it. Maybe it's time you saw it too. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. Oh, Richard, she whispered. Our girl did good, didn't she? Just not the way we expected. The tension in the room shifted, like storm clouds parting to reveal unexpected sunshine. Richard Montgomery III, titan of industry, stood in a farmhouse kitchen surrounded by people who measured wealth in ways he was just beginning to understand. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the rebellious girl who had defied him, but the woman who had built something worthy of the Montgomery name, even while rejecting everything he thought that name meant. Well, he said finally, his voice gruff with emotion he rarely showed, I suppose we should discuss those terms in detail. As the evening progressed, the farmhouse kitchen transformed into an unlikely boardroom. Dr. Thompson and Patricia Whitmore huddled over spreadsheets, while Alexander and James debated extraction technologies. The initial tension had given way to focused energy, the kind that emerged when people with different expertise found common ground in a shared vision. The first phase would focus on the northern section, James explained, spreading out a detailed map. That area has the highest concentration of minerals, but it's also where we've had the most success with our regenerative farming techniques. We'll need to be especially careful there. Alexander nodded, his business mind already calculating possibilities. We could start with a small-scale demonstration project, prove the concept before scaling up. He glanced at Isabella with a hint of his old brotherly smile. You always did prefer to test things thoroughly before jumping in. Some things don't change, Isabella agreed, remembering how she used to help him with his science projects, insisting on running each experiment multiple times to verify the results. Victoria, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, suddenly spoke up. Isabella, darling, where exactly would you want us to fit into all of this? Besides the financial aspect, I mean. The question caught Isabella off guard. She looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw something she hadn't noticed before. Uncertainty, yes, but also a genuine desire to understand. Well, Isabella said slowly, we've been thinking about establishing an educational foundation, something to support sustainable agriculture research, provide scholarships for young farmers, maybe create an innovation center for developing new environmental technologies. She paused, watching her mother's expression carefully. It would need someone with experience in nonprofit management, someone who knows how to bring the right people together. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. She had spent decades organizing charity events and sitting on foundation boards. Skills Isabella had once dismissed as mere social networking, but now recognized as valuable expertise. I might know some people who would be interested in something like that, Victoria said carefully, her fingers finally still on her pearl necklace. Richard, who had been deep in conversation with Dr. Chen about regulatory frameworks, turned at the sound of his wife's voice. Something in his expression softened as he watched Victoria and Isabella talking about foundation structures and board development. Miguel cleared his throat. Mrs. Montgomery, we've been wanting to expand our community outreach programs. Maybe you'd be interested in seeing what we've done so far? The night deepened, but no one seemed eager to leave. Sarah from the farmer's market board brought out coffee and homemade apple pie. Dr. Thompson pulled up satellite images showing the potential impact of their proposed methods. Through it all, the conversation flowed more easily, punctuated by occasional laughter and moments of genuine connection. At one point, Isabella found herself alone with her father near the window. Outside, the moon had risen, casting silver light across the fields they had worked so hard to nurture. You remember what you used to tell me about legacy? She asked quietly. About how it's not just what you build, but how you build it. Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. I remember a lot of things I used to tell you. I'm beginning to think you understood them better than I did. Before Isabella could respond, James called them back to the table. Patricia Whitmore had drafted a preliminary framework for the partnership, and Dr. Chen was outlining the next steps in the approval process. We'll need to form several working groups, Alexander was saying, his organizational skills in full swing. Environmental impact, community relations, technical development, financial structure. Don't forget the agricultural preservation team, James added. Everything else has to work around maintaining soil health and crop production. Victoria, who had been taking notes with surprising enthusiasm, looked up. What about housing? If this becomes a research and education center, we'll need accommodation for visiting scholars, students. She caught herself, perhaps worried she was overstepping. But Isabella beamed. Actually, Mom, we've been looking at some sustainable housing designs. Maybe you'd like to see the proposals. The atmosphere in the room had shifted so gradually that Isabella hadn't noticed until this moment. The lines between the Montgomerys and the farming community, between corporate interests and environmental concerns, between past hurts and future possibilities. They hadn't disappeared, but they had softened, become permeable. Dr. Thompson was explaining something about soil composition to Patricia Whitmore, who was actually taking notes. Alexander and Miguel were discovering a shared interest in innovative business models, and James was watching it all with that quiet smile that had first captured Isabella's heart years ago. Richard cleared his throat. There's still one thing we haven't discussed. All eyes turned to him. How do we ensure that all of this, he gestured around the room, encompassing not just the business proposal, but the unlikely gathering of people, stays true to its original vision, How do we prevent it from becoming just another corporate acquisition? The question hung in the air, weighted with the legacy of countless family businesses that had lost their soul in the pursuit of profit. Isabella felt the familiar pressure of expectations, but this time it was different. This time, she was ready. Isabella took a deep breath, her eyes meeting each person in the room before settling on her father. "We protect it with something stronger than contracts and corporate bylaws," she said. "We protect it with shared purpose and mutual accountability." She walked to a cabinet and pulled out a thick binder, well-worn, its pages dog-eared and marked with colorful tabs. "This is our farm's constitution. Every decision we've made, every principle we've followed, every promise we've kept to our community. It's all documented here, not just what we did, but why we did it." James picked up where she left off. "We've built a system of checks and balances. Every major decision requires approval from representatives of three groups: the agricultural team, the community council, and the environmental oversight committee." "That sounds incredibly inefficient," Alexander interjected, though his tone was more curious than critical. "It can be," Isabella acknowledged, "but it means we never lose sight of the bigger picture. No single interest can override the others." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "That's part of why the state is so interested in this model. It's not just about the technology, it's about governance structure." Richard leaned forward, his business instincts engaged. "And how would Montgomery Financial fit into this structure?" "As an equal partner," James replied, "with equal representation and equal responsibility to the whole." Victoria, who had been studying the farm's constitution, looked up. "These community programs, they're quite extensive. Weekly farmers markets, educational workshops, health initiatives. They're not side projects," Isabella explained. "They're central to everything we do. The minerals beneath this soil are valuable, yes, but the real wealth is in the knowledge we've developed, the systems we've built, the lives we've touched." Patricia Whitmore was rapidly typing on her laptop. "We could structure it as a benefit corporation," she suggested. "That would allow us to legally protect the social and environmental mission while still operating as a profitable entity." Alexander snapped his fingers. "Better yet, a hybrid structure. The mineral extraction and agricultural operations under one entity, the educational and community programs under a connected nonprofit. With cross-pollination between the two," Victoria added, warming to the idea. "The profit center supporting the community initiatives informing the business practices." Richard watched this exchange with growing amazement. His wife and son, who had once dismissed Isabella's choices as youthful rebellion, were now eagerly building upon her vision. Miguel spoke up from his corner. "Don't forget the cooperative aspect. Many of us local farmers have invested years of work and knowledge into developing these methods. We need to protect that too." "What if," Isabella said slowly, "we created a third entity, a trust managed jointly by the business, the non-profit, and the cooperative? All major decisions would require consensus from all three branches." Dr. Thompson was already sketching this structure on a notepad. "It's like a three-legged stool," he mused, "each leg essential for stability, none able to stand alone." "But who would oversee it all?" Alexander asked. "Who would make sure the different parts work together?" All eyes turned to Isabella and James. They had built this dream from the ground up, earned the trust of their community, proven their vision was more than just idealism. Richard stood up, his posture straight, but his expression softer than Isabella had seen in years. "I have a suggestion," he said, "but first, I owe my daughter an apology." The room fell silent. Richard Montgomery III was not a man known for admitting mistakes. "Isabella," he continued, his voice rough with emotion, "when you left to marry James, I thought you were choosing a simple life over an important one. I couldn't have been more wrong. You've built something far more complex, far more meaningful than anything I imagined for you." Victoria dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. Alexander stared at his father in astonishment. "What you've created here," Richard gestured around the room, "it's not just a business model or a farming operation. It's a blueprint for the future. And if Montgomery Financial is going to be part of that future, we need to do it right." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek folder with the Montgomery Financial logo. "I had our lawyers draw up some preliminary papers before we came, standard acquisition documents." He He walked to the wood stove in the corner of the kitchen and, with deliberate ceremony, dropped the folder into the flames. "I think," he said, watching the papers catch fire, "we need to start fresh, together, as equals." The crackling of the burning papers was the only sound in the room as the weight of this moment settled over everyone. Years of family tension, of competing visions, of hurt and misunderstanding, all of it transforming in the fire's heat. In the silence that followed Richard's gesture, Isabella felt tears welling up in her eyes. James squeezed her hand gently, his quiet strength anchoring her as it had so many times before. "Dad," she started, her voice wavering slightly. But Richard wasn't finished. He turned to James, extending his hand. "Son," he said, the word carrying years of unspoken acceptance, "I believe I owe you an apology as well. You saw in my daughter what I was too blind to see, not just her heart, but her vision, her strength." James shook his father-in-law's hand firmly. "She got that strength from somewhere," he said with a slight smile, "and that stubbornness too." A ripple of laughter broke the tension in the room. Victoria was openly crying now, but her smile was radiant. Alexander looked both shocked and impressed. His father had never admitted being wrong about anything, let alone made such a public reversal. Dr. Chen cleared her throat. "I hate to interrupt this moment, but we should discuss the immediate next steps. The state's pilot program has some deadlines we need to consider." "Right," Isabella said, wiping her eyes and straightening her shoulders. "We need to form the initial working groups. Mom, would you be willing to head up the Community Relations Committee? Your experience with nonprofits would be invaluable." Victoria's face lit up. Yes, of course. Actually, I have some ideas about involving the local schools. Perhaps we could develop a curriculum around sustainable agriculture and responsible resource management." "Perfect," James nodded. "And Alex, we could use your expertise on the financial structure team. There are some innovative funding models we've been exploring." Alexander was already pulling out his tablet. "I've been reading about green bonds and impact investing. If we structure this right, we could attract a whole new category of institutional investors." Patricia Whitmore, who had been furiously taking notes, looked up. "What about the international aspect? These methods you've developed, they could be applicable in developing nations, regions struggling with resource conflicts." "That's phase 2, Isabella explained. "First, we prove it works here, build a model that others can follow." She turned to her father. "Dad, would you consider chairing the oversight board? We need someone who understands both the business and the importance of staying true to our principles." Richard nodded slowly. "On one condition," he paused, looking around the room, "that we rename this entire initiative. Not Montgomery, not Cooper, but something that reflects what it truly is. A bridge between different worlds, different ways of thinking about wealth and progress." Miguel spoke up from his corner. "In my culture, we have a saying, La tierra no es herencia de nuestros padres, sino préstamo de nuestros hijos. The land is not an inheritance from our parents, but a loan from our children." "Heritage Bridge," Victoria suggested softly. "Or maybe Legacy Bridge Partners." "Bridge to Tomorrow," Alexander offered, then grinned sheepishly. "Though that might be a bit too obvious." "Terra Futura," Dr. Thompson mused. "Latin for Earth Future. It has a nice scientific ring to it." Isabella and James exchanged glances. "What about a Harmony Fields initiative?" James suggested. "It's about bringing different elements into balance. Agriculture and industry, profit and preservation, family and community." "Harmony Fields," Richard repeated thoughtfully. "A place where opposing forces find common ground." He nodded. "I like it." Dr. Chen was already making notes. "We'll need to register the name, set up the legal entities, draft the founding documents." "Wait," Isabella interrupted. She walked to the kitchen window and gestured for everyone to join her. The moon was now high in the sky, bathing the farm in silver light. In the distance, the greenhouses glowed softly, and beyond them, the gentle slopes of their fields stretched toward the horizon. "Before we get lost in the details," she said, "I want everyone to look at what we're really talking about. This land, these fields, they've been growing food for generations. And with what we're planning, they'll keep growing food for generations to come. But they'll also grow something else. Hope. Hope that we can find better ways to use our resources. Hope that families can heal. Hope that different worlds can come together and create something new." Victoria slipped her arm through Richard's. Alexander stood closer to his sister than he had in years. James wrapped his arm around Isabella's waist. The others gathered around the window, each lost in their own thoughts about what they were witnessing. Not just a business deal or a family reconciliation, but the birth of something larger than all of them. The night was far from over. There were still details to discuss, plans to make, challenges to address. But standing there in the moonlight, surrounded by family both old and new, Isabella felt a profound sense of rightness. They had found their way to something none of them had imagined when the day began. Not just a solution to the mineral rights question, but a new understanding of what wealth really meant. As weeks turned into months, Harmony Field's initiative took shape in ways none of them could have predicted that first transformative night. The Montgomery-Cooper partnership became a model of collaborative leadership, with each family contributing their unique strengths to the vision. Victoria threw herself into the community programs with unexpected passion. Her years of social networking proved invaluable as she built bridges between urban philanthropists and rural farming communities. The educational center she developed became a hub for sustainable agriculture studies, drawing students and researchers from around the world. Alexander discovered a talent for innovative financial structuring. He created a unique investment model that attracted socially conscious investors while protecting the project's core values. To everyone's surprise, he eventually moved his young family to a house near the farm, wanting his children to grow up understanding both worlds. Richard's transformation was perhaps the most profound. The man who had once measured success solely in profit margins became a passionate advocate for sustainable business practices. His presentations at financial conferences, explaining how Harmony Fields balanced profit with preservation, inspired other companies to rethink their approach to resource management. The farm itself flourished under the new structure. Using carefully developed techniques, they began extracting minerals while maintaining active agriculture above ground. The sight of organic crops growing over sustainable mining operations became a powerful symbol of what was possible when different approaches worked in harmony. James and Isabella's innovative farming methods gained international recognition. Delegations from developing nations visited regularly, learning how to implement similar programs in their own countries. The couple found themselves traveling the world as consultants, sharing their knowledge while always returning to the land that had started it all. But perhaps the most meaningful changes were the small ones. Sunday dinners became a tradition again, with both families gathering in the farmhouse kitchen. Victoria learned to make preserves from Isabella. Richard discovered a surprising satisfaction in working with his hands, often joining James for morning chores when he visited. Alexander's children grew up climbing apple trees and learning about soil composition alongside their financial literacy lessons. One evening, 5 years after that pivotal night, the extended family gathered on the farmhouse porch. The sun was setting over fields that now represented a revolutionary approach to land use. Gardens flourished alongside careful mineral extraction. Solar panels powered both mining equipment and irrigation systems. In the distance, new buildings housed researchers and students, while preserving the rural character of the landscape. "You know," Richard said, watching his grandchildren chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, "I spent years teaching you about building a legacy, Isabella, but you ended up teaching me what legacy really means." Isabella, her hands dirty from the day's work, but her face content, smiled at her father. "We all did it together, Dad. That's what makes it work." Victoria, looking elegant even in her gardening apron, added, "Who would have thought our family's greatest achievement would grow from what we once saw as its greatest rebellion?" James wrapped an arm around his wife. "Sometimes the best future grows from the seeds of conflict." Alexander, who had been typing on his tablet, looked up with a grin. "Speaking of the future, wait until you see the latest sustainability reports. We're not just maintaining productivity, we're increasing it. The International Committee can hardly believe the numbers." The conversation flowed easily, mixing business with family matters, environmental concerns with community achievements. The rigid boundaries that had once divided their worlds had dissolved, replaced by a deeper understanding that true prosperity grew from balance, not dominance. As night fell over Harmony Fields, the stars emerged above the land that had witnessed their transformation. The Montgomery name still carried weight in financial circles, but now it stood for something more, a bridge between old wealth and new values, between corporate power and environmental stewardship, between past and future. Isabella looked around at her gathered family, by blood and by choice, and felt a profound sense of completion. They had done more than strike gold or heal family wounds. They had created a new way forward, proving that the greatest riches often grow from the soil of our deepest challenges. The farm's dinner bell rang in the distance, calling them all inside to another shared meal, another chance to blend their worlds, another moment in their continuing story of transformation. As they headed in, Isabella paused for one last look at the darkening fields. The land had given them more than minerals or crops or profit. It had given them the wisdom to see that true wealth grows not from what we take from the earth, but from what we learn to give back to it and to each other.